Last year, myself and a group of colleagues from the law school, and Gabrielle, Alex, Rebecca's here somewhere up the back, and Nari Nafeen, took part in a reading group. We were trying to find something that we could do that would be intellectually satisfying and yet not connected to our research or our immediate teaching goals. And what we decided to do was to read Eichmann in Jerusalem, and that was my first encounter with that as a text. So I offer these remarks tonight, by no means as an expert on Arendt or a specialist in the subject, but I wanted to talk about this in order to honour that time we spent together as a group, but also the time that we spend pursuing intellectual ideas because we think they matter, not because they're connected to some research or other output that we're concerned with. That's why I wanted to focus on that today. On the 11th of April, 1961, the Israeli government put the Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann on trial in Jerusalem. Following the Wannsee conference in 1942, Eichmann was given the task of organising the transportation of millions of Jewish people from the occupied territories and into concentration camps. The trial itself was set up by the Israeli prosecution to be not just a trial of Eichmann, but also a bearing witness of the Holocaust itself. The prosecution called over 100 witnesses, and for 14 weeks the trial made international headlines. One of the trial's most famous witnesses was Hannah Arendt. At her request, perhaps at her insistence, she reported on the trial for the New Yorker magazine. And her essays were then collected and published in a book in 1963 entitled Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil. More than half a century after its publication, the book still manages to get under people's skin. Indeed, it is hard, if not impossible today, to think about the Eichmann trial outside of the framework of the book. And I cannot recall a text not associated with a political or a religious movement, so the Bible or the Communist Manifesto, for example, would be excluded, that has had the same impact. And in fact, one challenge or one thing of interest you might do this evening during this talk is see if you can think of a book that has had such a lasting impact and which has also managed to eclipse the event itself that it was actually reporting on. So have a think about that. Last year, Margarete von Trotter, who's a very famous filmmaker, has previously done films on figures like Rosa Luxemburg, dramatised Arendt's reporting of the Eichmann trial in a new film called Hannah Arendt. The Eichmann trial marked a major shift in Arendt's thinking and provided her with a fresh and original theory of evil. When she wrote The Origins of Totalitarianism in 1951, Arendt used the phrase radical evil as a description for Nazi concentration camps or what she termed death factories. Such an invention, wrote Arendt, could only have come from an intention to do evil. The concept of radical evil was derived from Immanuel Kant, and Arendt claimed to have begun reading Kant at the age of 12, which if any of you have tried reading him, is pretty significant. For Kant, the noun evil did sometimes require the adjective radical. Radical evil is a type of evil which is rooted in an evil motivation or an intention to do evil. Having missed the Nuremberg trials, the Eichmann trial was Arendt's first opportunity to see and listen to a Nazi official in the flesh. She was immediately struck by how normal Eichmann appeared. She labelled him a random buffoon and said that he was not even sinister. Instead, Arendt described Eichmann as a superficial conformist with no sense of personal responsibility. He, according to Arendt, had nothing but banal motives, such as the desire to move up in the Nazi bureaucracy and prove himself to be the perfect civil servant by completing his tasks with maximum efficiency. These, argued Arendt, were not radical motives connected to a lust for power, revenge, or even a hatred for the Jewish people. And I should point out that her description of Eichmann is thoroughly contested, especially in more recent literature, but this was her reading of him. Arendt had begun to formulate an alternative conception of evil in the 10-year gap between when she published The Origins of Totalitarianism and the Eichmann trial. Central to her thinking during this period was the idea of thoughtlessness, and she described this term in her 1958 book, The Human Condition, as follows. Thoughtlessness is the heedless, reckless, or hopeless confusion or complacent repetition of truths which have become trivial and empty. Arendt suspected that this phenomena was very widespread and even described it as the outstanding characteristic of our time. There in Jerusalem, right before her eyes, was a living incarnation of this idea. In describing Eichmann as thoughtless, Arendt did not mean he was careless or that he was stupid. Rather, Arendt thought that Eichmann lacked common sense, the ability to be reflective, and to make moral judgments. Eichmann, indeed, throughout the trial, could recite in complex detail his work. He even gave to the judges a variation of Kant's categorical imperative. However, Eichmann could not ask the question that Arendt considered most essential to a moral life. Can I live with myself if I commit this deed? Following her report on the Eichmann trial, Arendt stopped using the phrase radical evil. She did not deny that human beings could act from base motives and used phrases like calculated wickedness to describe immoral or heinous actions. However, as she explained in a letter to the philosopher and historian Gershom Scholem, it is indeed my opinion that evil is never radical. She says it can overgrow and lay waste. It spreads like a fungus. It's thought-defying. This is her idea that it's related to the idea of thoughtlessness. But she says only good has depth. Only good can be radical. Arendt says that this insight represented a cura postoria in terms of her own personal history and development. And yet, her conclusion caused many to label her a Nazi apologist and a traitor to the Jewish people. While most scholars concede that there are passages in her report, and I think small passages that were insensitive and poorly expressed, Arendt never once suggests that Eichmann was innocent, and she even supported the death penalty. And this put her at odds with other notable Jewish figures like Martin Buber. And even in her book on the Eichmann trial, Deborah Lipsard claims that Ben-Gurion, the then Prime Minister of Israel, had hesitations about the death penalty. I'm not sure if that's of the veracity of that argument, but that's her claim. Arendt's goal was to pay attention to Eichmann's story, and she tells his story in enormous detail so that people can understand how an ordinary person could commit great acts of evil. Arendt's examination of Eichmann concerns most thoroughly his failure to think. More specifically, Eichmann failed to be critical of positive law and to distance himself from the obligations that Nazi law and policy had placed upon him. For Arendt, thinking, the act of thinking, implicates the subject or the person in a sociality or plurality, and this cannot be divided by acts of genocide. According to Arendt, no thinking being can commit genocide. Of course, one can have such thoughts and implement a genocidal policy, as Eichmann clearly did, but Arendt says that such calculation could not properly be called thinking. And this is an incredibly bold claim, and many scholars have criticised her for holding out an overly normative account of what thinking is. And I'll return to some of the critiques of her position later on. One rhetorical feature of Arendt's report on Eichmann is that time and time again, Arendt directs her commentary directly to Eichmann, as though the two were in conversation. One such moment occurs in response to Eichmann's contention in court that he had, quote, lived his whole life according to Kant's moral precepts, and especially according to the Kantian definition of duty. One can imagine how scandalous this moment was for Arendt, and she writes, "This was outrageous and incomprehensible, since Kant's moral philosophy is so closely bound up with man's faculty of judgment, which rules out blind obedience." Eichmann provides a somewhat confused explanation of Kantianism. On the one hand, he says, quote, "I meant by my remarks about Kant, the principle of my will must always be such that it can become the principle of general laws, a summation of Kant's categorical imperative." And in the same breath, Eichmann acknowledges that once he was charged with carrying out the final solution, he had ceased to live by Kantian principles and was no longer the master of his own deeds. Arendt was clearly incensed by Eichmann's attempt at appropriating Kant, and she offers the following rejoinder as though she was speaking directly to him. She writes, "Kant, to be sure, had never intended to say anything of the sort. On the contrary, to him, every man was a legislator the moment he started to act. By using his practical reason, man found the principles that could and should become the principles of law." Arendt continued this analysis of practical reason and obedience 7 years later, when she delivered a series of lectures at the New School for Social Research on Kant's political philosophy. Indeed, Judith Butler suggests that we can understand much of Arendt's later work as an extended quarrel with Eichmann and an attempt to reappropriate Kant's ideas, which Eichmann was trying to use for his own purpose. In her report, Arendt also criticises the three presiding judges for failing to understand that a new kind of person had come into being during the Second World War, and that this person had to be judged according to different standards. For Arendt, this was both a historical and a philosophical problem. What happened during the Second World War, such that persons were formed in such a way that thinking, in the way Arendt describes thinking, was no longer available to them? Arendt was not interested in a psychological explanation to this question, and indeed, numerous psychologists testified during Eichmann's trial that Eichmann was neither perverted nor sadistic. One psychologist remarked that he is, quote, more normal than I am after meeting with him. So there was never any doubt about his psychological health. In her view, in Arendt's view, Eichmann simply acted according to a brutal law that had become both normal and normalised. His crime was that he failed to think and exercise practical reason, even as he claimed to be Kantian. In the final pages of her report, Arendt steps up her direct engagement with Eichmann. Her tone shifts dramatically, and she abandons the first person and speaks through a plural. She uses we throughout the last passages. And I think it's worth looking at this last passage at some length. She says, "You also said that your role in the final solution was an accident and that almost anybody could have taken your place, so that potentially almost all Germans are equally guilty. What you meant to say was that where all or most all are guilty, nobody is. This is indeed quite a common conclusion, but one that we are not willing to grant you. Guilt and innocence before the law are of an objective nature, and even if 80 million Germans had done as you did, this would not have been an excuse for you." So whose is the plural voice that emerges here? Is it Arendt in some performative judgment? Is it the voice of civil society, the sociality that she thinks we're connected to? Is it what she thinks the three judges should have said? She doesn't explain. But she concludes her report as follows. Just as you supported and carried out a policy of not wanting to share the earth with the Jewish people and the people of a number of other nations, as though you and your superiors had any right to determine who should and should not inhabit the world, we find that no one, that is, no member of the human race, can be expected to share the earth with you. This is the reason, and the only reason, you must hang. And I think Arendt's acceptance of the death penalty in the book is one of the most controversial parts. And I think it's important to keep in mind that for Arendt, punishment, such as a jail sentence, was available only if there was some condition under which you could have a future life with this person. For Arendt, the death penalty was what comes into play when the conditions for that future life are no longer there, when someone has done something so bad that you can't imagine cohabitation with that person again. In Arendt's judgment, it was Eichmann's actions concerning with whom he should share the earth that ultimately justifies his hanging. This is obviously a different crime than Arendt's earlier criticism of Eichmann for failing to think. And indeed, the two can only be reconciled if there is some intimate relationship between thinking and cohabitation. So the critical question for Arendt becomes, does thinking commit us to the preservation of plurality such that if we seek to destroy it, we cease to be thinking beings? Such a direct link is difficult to trace. Arendt describes thinking, however, Arendt does describe thinking as an exercise of the plural self. Thinking is the way we keep company with ourselves. We are, according to Arendt, internally divided and must remain so if we are to engage in the practice of thinking. She writes, quote, even in the singularity or duality of thinking processes, duality is somehow present in a germinal form, insofar as I can think only by splitting into two, although I am one. It is also clear from Arendt's later writing that she believed that the activity of thinking could condition human beings against committing evil acts. Thinking interrupts our everyday and sometimes automatic judgments and initiates an internal dialogue between me and myself. It was this internal dialogue, grounded in a duality of consciousness, that Socrates tried to awaken in his discussants. Only through cultivating our inner duality can individuals awaken the voice of conscience and fully realise themselves as political and thus social beings. The ultimate responsibility for such fully realised subjects cannot be an uncritical allegiance to the law, since law itself might be immoral. In this case, we have a responsibility to oppose immoral law and even engage in disobedience. And this, for Arendt, is exactly what Eichmann failed to grasp. If we ask, according to what norms or what criteria we decide whether or not a special or a specific law should be followed, the answer, according to Arendt, has to do with whether or not we can continue to live with ourselves, to keep company with ourselves after we have committed such an act. Okay? And this is a distinguishing point in her use of Kant. Kant would have answered that question differently. For Arendt, the question is, can you still live with yourself? Can you keep this internal dialogue with yourself going after you've committed some acts? Some acts that we engage in might make us want to stop that dialogue, to stop having that inner conversation. Seen in this light, it might be possible to interpret Arendt's final judgment of Eichmann, and perhaps judgment in general, not simply as an individual act, but an implicit recognition of plurality. By adopting the plural we, Arendt presents herself as a plural subject connected to a broader sociality. What she judges Eichmann for was precisely the right that he and other Nazi officials sought to deny the Jewish people, coexistence in that plurality. And it's in the name of this that she judges Eichmann and eventually sentences him to death. Before continuing, I think it's important to provide some evaluation of the theory of evil that Arendt presents in Eichmann in Jerusalem. And Arendt herself, I think, would demand nothing less of her readers. In my estimation, the most important part of her report is her argument regarding the disenchantment of evil. For many commentators, Nazis, like Eichmann, perfectly embodied the romantic and highly religious conception of evil that dominated the 20th century. But I think that language of good versus evil has also been resurrected more recently in political times. You could think, for example, of George Bush's characterization of good and evil, light and darkness, those kind of concepts. As Arendt demonstrated, evil is not black and white. Evil does not take the form of a fallen good, like Lucifer, a fallen angel. Rather, it is the unsettling image of Eichmann, in all of his ordinariness, that is the proper image of evil for the 21st century. The bureaucratization of life and death initiated by the Nazis meant that even banal people like Eichmann could be directly responsible for the deaths of hundreds and thousands of people. J. Bernstein captures this point as follows. He writes, "What modernity has made emphatic is that the stakes of evil, with respect to the victim, can be put in place without thought and temptation. Those stakes can be realised with the same gestures that make railroads dependable and factories models of efficiency." However, is evil always thoughtless? Can one accept the view that Eichmann simply abandoned the dual structure in his thinking? Do we want to imagine that he was once a self-reflective thinker and that his own actions caused him to stop keeping company with himself? Or was there some culturally prevalent disowning of self in Germany that made his acts possible? More broadly, can we really suggest that Heidegger's turn to Nazism was the result of thoughtlessness? Do we think that what distinguished Denmark and Bulgaria, who resisted the Nazi occupation and their policies, from Poland, who did not, was that the former were deep in thought, while the latter were shallow and thoughtless? Are not indifference and coldness, as Adorno suggested, more likely sources of immorality than thoughtlessness? A major problem that Arendt faces A major problem that Arendt faces in her claim that thoughtlessness is the cause of evil is that it depends on the opposite, namely that thoughtfulness is the primary source of good and resistance to committing evil deeds. In holding this position, I think that Arendt ignores a lot of well-documented history that illustrates that immoral acts can also be committed from a point of conscience. One interesting illustration of this point, and it's by no means the only, is Gene Hatzfeld's report on the Rwandan genocide in his book Machete Season. Hatzfeld claims Arendt to be the inspiration for his book, and he interviews a dozen or so Hutu farmers who took part in the slaughter of their Tutsi neighbours. Drawing on these interviews, Hatzfeld describes how the slaughter gradually became a matter of routine. Gradually, the workers began to see their machete, which they would once use as an instrument for work, as an instrument for murder, what they called cutting. The men even began to see the slaughter as similar to farming, only more hectic, and in the words of one, more satisfying. What is so disturbing about Hatzfeld's report is how ordinary these men were. Like Eichmann, their task quickly became a matter of routine over which they seemed to have lost the capacity for judgment. Even after the events, the men did not and could not express regret about what they had done. It was as if some capacity for human response was sealed over permanently. And yet, if murder had not somehow become a matter of routine, it would surely not have been possible for the slaughter of 800,000 of their neighbours to have occurred in just 3 months. Further to this description, Hatzfeld also notes that many of the men involved found a kind of satisfaction in the killing that they did not find in farming. It was common practice also for Hutu men to rape their victims before killing and to even keep them as sex slaves for a period. And Hatzfeld concludes that there was some sexual subtext to the killing and that participants often felt sexual excitement from their actions. Reflecting on reports like this gives one cause to suspect that Arendt insists too much that heinous immoral acts have no depth and that they are merely a surface phenomena. The development of her thinking on radical evil may simultaneously represent her turning her back on the darker side of human potentiality. And I prefer to talk about potentiality rather than human nature, which I find to be a very ambiguous, homogenizing concept. I don't find it very useful. Human beings are the kinds of animals who have the capacity to take pleasure in having power over another. Cruelty persists in part because some find it a source of pleasure. Human beings can cause others to suffer humiliation, to feel degraded, and to even turn them into marionettes, which is how Arendt described the concentration camps, turning men into marionettes. In other words, some human beings commit evil acts, like Eichmann, because they are thoughtless components of a larger, bureaucratized system, while for others, circumstance and situation enliven a darker aspect of our potentiality. Alongside Arendt's writing on the disenchantment of evil, the sense in which her report on Eichmann has the most significance for us today relates to the general atrophy in our powers of judgment. As the distance between our participation in decision-making widens in a mass technological society, our capacity to think and to express judgment on moral and political matters also diminishes. With this distance comes an increase in our reliance on popular ideas. Arendt called these banisters, we might call them memes. And these help us navigate the complexities of everyday life without needing to pause and reflect. The trouble, Arendt claimed, was that these banisters make it difficult for individuals to identify and reflect upon significant changes in the public sphere. Moreover, she writes that they lull us into a kind of automatic judgment in which the singularity and the specificity of an individual event loses its importance. So what Arendt feared was not the possibility that each of us could be like Eichmann and realise our potential for evil. Rather, I think that the most direct relevance for her study for us today is the worry she expresses regarding the increasingly automatic and unreflective quality of our judgments. Armed with these banisters, Arendt makes the claim that ordinary people can unreflectively turn to fascism. And it's important that we take heed of Arendt's warning, because, as she warns during her report on Eichmann, the precedent set by the Nazis is likely to be repeated. And I think this is perhaps the most chilling passage in the entire book. She says, the particular reasons that speak for the possibility of a repetition of the crimes committed by the Nazis are even more plausible. The frightening coincidence of the modern population explosion with the discovery of technical devices that, through automation, will make large sections of a population superfluous, even in terms of labour, and that, through nuclear energy, make it possible to deal with this twofold threat by the use of instruments, besides which Hitler's gassing installations look like an evil child's fumbling toys, should be enough to make us tremble. That the full bureaucratisation of murder has not happened on the same scale as we witnessed in the Second World War should not give us grounds for optimism. As Max Weber recognised, modern life continues to be subject to the protocols of bureaucratic instrumental rationality. Alongside this is the disciplining effects of contemporary surveillance and the imperatives of technological progress. Commentators like the political scientist Sheldon Wallen argue that these and other developments have given rise to what he calls inverted totalitarianism, a political hybrid where economic and state powers are conjoined and virtually unbridled. At best, Wallen argues that Western democracies are managed and that the public is shepherded, not sovereign. At worst, Wallen contends that they are a place where corporate power no longer answers to state controls. While Wallen makes it clear that inverted totalitarianism is in no way morally or politically comparable to the totalitarianism that we see in Nazi Germany, he warns that unchecked economic power risks verging on total power and has its own unnerving pathologies. Should this emerging system turn inward against a population, either at home or abroad, then, following Arendt, I think we all have cause to tremble. So, just some concluding remarks. In producing her report on the Eichmann trial, Arendt demonstrated a moral courage that I think ought to inspire us all. The presentation of her report models the idea of an intellectual whose station it is to raise difficult questions publicly, to confront orthodoxy, and in the words of Edward Said, to be prepared to be embarrassing, contrary, and even unpleasant. Arendt's understanding of the responsibilities and the duties that inure to a moral principle were deeply influenced by her close circle of friends. And these people modelled for her what moral courage looked like. In 1968, she released a book called Men in Dark Times. And here Arendt presented biographical sketches of the friends who she believed embodied integrity. She introduced the text by noting, "Even in the darkest times, we have a right to expect some illumination. This may well come less from theories and concepts than from the uncertain, flickering, and often weak light that some men and women in their lives and work will kindle under almost all circumstances and shed over the time given on earth." A particular source of light for Arendt in her life was her friend and teacher Karl Jaspers. Jaspers stood firm and stated clearly his opposition to Nazi policy at a time of great persecution. He continued to criticise publicly the Nazis while he was teaching in Heidelberg and was only rescued in the last days of the war as he and his wife were scheduled for deportation to the concentration camps. After the war, Jaspers held a special place amongst Arendt's friends. She described him in the following terms: "He is an intellectual who never despised the world, never retreated into himself, but with a sovereign naturalness and a certain cheerful recklessness exposed himself to the currents of public life, speaking out with constant reasonableness on public issues. And what a contrast that is to the other important person in her life, Martin Heidegger, and others like that. That Arendt chose to dedicate one of her final books to her friends reveals something of the urgent philosophical claim that she introduces not in Eichmann, but in everything else she wrote. Namely, that the most powerful way to combat moral and political issues is the practice of politics, of people gathering together, taking strength from each other, and collectively building a form of life where the worth of each is made essential. Thank you very much for listening.